All right, hey folks, so today we're going to take a trip down memory lane and see what we can learn about strength and size from some of the strongest men in the world. So firstly, thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any questions or comments, pop them down below. And if you'd like to work with me on your own strength and physique goals, there's a link in the description. Right, now, taking a trip down memory lane, most of you have heard of Westside Barbell. Yep, you've heard of Louis Simmons. You've probably even implemented some conjugate system training in your own training careers, if not actually full-blown trained conjugate right now. Now, back in the early 2000s, around about the sort of advent of the internet, Louis was putting out a lot of good information on the internet. But alongside Louis, there was another barbell club who hasn't really kept up with putting out information as much as Louis and his Westside Barbell juggernaut has, but they were also very good. And I want to teach you a bit about them today. Those guys are called Metal Militia. Metal Militia was a powerlifting group out of the States, and it still is active in very many states. And when I first heard of Metal Militia, it was around about the same time that I'd heard of Westside Barbell, sort of early 2000s. You know, Louis was putting out a ton of information on the internet, and he was also putting out a ton of stuff in the various powerlifting magazines of the day. Louis was a visionary, and he was always looking to expand his information and help people. Around about the same time, Metal Militia were there as well, releasing articles talking about their training method and what they do differently. And there was sort of a healthy rivalry between Westside Barbell and Metal Militia. Back in the early 2000s, most people viewed Metal Militia and Westside Barbell as on equal footing, you know, whereas now I think much more people have heard of Westside Barbell and the conjugate method, and I would be surprised if any of you guys have heard of Metal Militia. But that's why I want to talk about it today, to see what we can learn from them and what they can teach us about getting big and strong. So let's crack on. Now, this was their weekly plan, so you can see it had some similarities to Louis' Westside Barbell. It was a couple of lower body days, a couple of upper body days, all centered around the power lifts. I want to say at this stage as well, Metal Militia were somewhat criticized for being only really applicable to geared lifters because they did a lot of board work. However, I will say this, back in the early 2000s and the late 90s, there wasn't really a great deal of distinction between raw and equipped for powerlifting. Like, I remember when I did my very first powerlifting competition, the federation that I competed in, which was what was then known as BORLA, which was the British Amateur Weightlifting Association, and their branch of powerlifting, which is now broken off and is now with the GBPF, they didn't have a raw division at all. And this was the biggest powerlifting federation in the UK. Back when I first started competing, they didn't have a raw division at all. There was no raw lifting, like it didn't exist. So the criticism was that this was catered towards equipped lifters, but the reality is, like, these guys were all just strong guys. They were benching in the region of 1,000 pounds. And so they were just strong dudes, you know. So they were raw benching 500 or 600 pounds. So they were strong guys, regardless of whether they were specialized in gear or not. So I don't think that criticism really holds up. So it holds up as much as you would criticize Westside for being equipped, which is, again, not always that valid. So anyway, this is their weekly plan. So in terms of their squat, they did a lot more actual squat work. It was much more of a linear style of training where they would do 5 sets of 5 further away from a meet and then moving into 3s and 1s as they got closer to a meet. The difference with this group was their assistance work was a lot more quad dominant. So they would pick 2 or 3 exercises, usually mostly compound lifts, but centered around the quads, like leg presses, lunges, stuff like that, you know, rather than Louis, who was doing things like glute ham raise and good mornings and things like that. Do that, and it would be for around about 4 to 5 sets of moderately high reps. They also point out that they don't really like plyometrics, so they didn't do stuff like box jumps and stuff like that, which Louis might employ. So they didn't like dynamic style of work. So that was their squat day, a fairly traditional linear squat day. Next was the raw bench day. Now, this was something like 4 to 5 hard sets of raw bench, top sets. So you would do something like a 5x5 or a 4x10. 5x5, of course, being very similar to one of Louis' versions of speed day, where he also does benches in that sort of 24 to 25 rep range. They would also on this day emphasize the pause bench, sometimes for a whole 5 count before they press up. Some band work and some higher rep floor presses were done on this day, that type of thing, like higher rep floor presses, board presses. But this was their raw bench day. Now, next up was a deadlift day, which they trained somewhat similarly to the squat. They believed that the sumo deadlift was easier to recover from. So they would do the sumos for the usual 5 top sets of 5s further away from a meet, 3s and 1s close to a meet. They also backed it up with rack pulls. And if they were doing conventional deadlifts, they did a lot more variety. And finally, it was their bench and their sort of heavy bench day or their geared bench day. This was really what they were known for. This was their impression everyone had of them, that they were bench specialists. And so they employed a lot of partial range work. So they warmed up raw to like a raw 3-board close grip bench, so very high. Then they went on to boards, and essentially the idea was to touch your chest with monstrous amounts of weight. They backed that up with band work, with rack assistance work, partial benches, all that kind of good stuff. Now, what can we learn from these guys to apply to our own training? Now, none of this is things which I haven't already talked about, because strong is strong. Strength recognizes strength, all right? The stuff which I say works is typical of stuff which other very strong people will say works as well. So that's why a lot of it is just a repeated message. I mean, it's important to repeat it, because it helps you guys at home listening to sort of pull away from the lot of BS out there. Like, you've got guys out there, like skinny guys out there, talking about how push-ups are all you need to grow lots of mass. It's like, come on, you know, if the strongest men and women in the world, and also the biggest, strongest YouTubers that you know, are saying, well, actually, you need this type of stuff, then it's probably a better view that you need this type of stuff, not just like push-ups. Okay, not mentioning anyone in particular. So anyway, what can we learn? Firstly, they employed quite a lot of single repetition work and ligament strengthening work, things which build their confidence and their ligaments and their entire upper body holding structure. So they were used to handling heavy weights at either the lockout of a bench, the lockout of a deadlift, or partial ranges of motion on the squat as well. So they were used to handling heavy weights. Now, that is important. Like, it's not traditional bodybuilding, but as I discussed recently, as a natural bodybuilder, you might need to take advantage of some of these extra forms of help to build your strength to the point where your physique is impressive. So yes, you know, doing single repetition work, or doing, I don't know, rack pulls above the knee, or slingshot work, or like lockouts, maybe that's not traditional bodybuilding work, sure. But it builds confidence. Yeah, it builds confidence. It builds holding power. It means that at least your ligaments aren't the weak point when you're repping out the bench trying to get a new PR. It means you're no longer intimidated by these heavy weights. So you're more likely to push that strength up, which is then likely to build more mass. So that's the first thing. They did work building confidence, building ligaments, and building entire holding structure, which I think is something. Like if you're standing at the top of a deadlift and you're shaking like crazy, you know, then it's not a good time. It doesn't say much for your ability to get that weight off the floor. Secondly, they all employed a slightly higher volume of work, everyone. This is true right the way across the board. One of the things I sort of hate to see is these minimalistic routines where, one, there's no real thought given to the individual volume needs of each muscle group. It's just like, yeah, do 2 sets each of everything. Yeah, really? Is that just a prescription for absolutely everything? And then 3 years down the line, people have got muscle imbalances in their delts and their biceps, and they're scratching their head thinking, why aren't my biceps growing? Who knows? Maybe because top set, back off set is not the panacea for life, you know. So higher amounts of volume, and also specifically trying to figure out volume for different areas. So next thing is a variety of exercises on a weekly basis. Now, I've said many times before that we should have markers of progression. So judge your progress over the next 6 months by how much you've improved on like 3 basic lifts. Now, that doesn't mean you can't employ a variety of other lifts in the confines of that program. So you should still be looking at pushing everything up. It's just use those for markers of progression. So like, for example, we can use the bench press. You know, the bench press is a great marker of progression for how well pretty much your entire front of your upper body is growing. So we can match together the bench press with the chin up, with the squat, as a decent indicator of how your entire body is growing over the next 6 months. But that doesn't mean that with the bench press, we're also employing things like the close grip bench press, the overhead press, the incline press, dumbbell benches, dips, all to grow the entire structure together. And then the bench press is demonstrating that we have grown and we are getting stronger. So have a variety of exercises on a weekly basis. Some of your biggest friends as a natural, genetically average bodybuilder and wannabe strength athlete is variety and periodization. If you can employ some simple, effective periodization and some decent variety into your training, that will do so much for keeping you injury-free and keeping you growing. So two of the ways that I sort of have talked about quite a lot are using deloads for periodization and also using waves. So you can deload, go back to the similar routine, or wave and go back to a different set of exercises, either way. But make sure you're having a variety of exercises within the confines of sensible periodization. Okay, so yes, change your exercises, but don't change your entire approach. All right. And finally, a specific approach to each lift and muscles. Notice how with Metal Militia, they did 2 bench days and they had 1 squat day and 1 deadlift day. The joke that we had when I was younger and getting into powerlifting was, like, don't let a bodybuilder out bench you. Because a lot of them did. Why? Because when I first got into powerlifting, I was influenced by all these minimalistic routines, and none of them could bench worth a damn. Because you generally need a lot more work for the upper body than you need for other areas like the squat and the deadlift. In general, most people that I find that I've seen over the years do need more work for the upper body musculature than they do for the lower body on a muscle per muscle basis. So most bodybuilders tended to, traditional style bodybuilders tended to bench quite a lot. Most powerlifters who didn't know what they were doing and followed like minimalistic routines ended up squatting and deadlifting pretty well, but their bench just was down the tubes for so long and never progressed. So the point here is, try and have a specific approach to each lift and each muscle group. Like, you might not need as much volume for your quads as you do need for, say, your glutes and your hamstrings. You might need more. It might be reversed, but start to think about how you can differentiate between different muscle groups. Really think about your training. Go, okay, well, yeah, do I align myself to high volume? Do I align myself to low volume? Rather than break away from that and think more of what do I need for each muscle group to progress? If you can start to write the trends down there, then it's a very powerful thing. Your training log, your own training diary, is the most powerful coach you'll ever have, as long as you know how to interpret the data in that. It's another tip for you guys. So that was a little bit of history of Metal Militia, and also 4 things that we can learn from them. And I would be interested to know how many of you guys have heard of Metal Militia. It's something that I heard of 20 years ago, but it's not something they've not really kept up to date with putting out as much material as Louis Simmons and Westside Barbell. So a lot of people have just sort of forgotten about them, but they were and are tremendously powerful organization of people, of powerlifters. So it's worth listening to at least what we can learn from them, if not, doing their approach. But certainly, what can we learn from them? What can we take from them? And as I say, most people who are trustworthy and who have gotten strong will tell you much of the same thing, and are natural, will tell you much of the same thing. It is a lot of these points which I cover in my videos. And the answer is not push-ups, exclusively anyway. Push-ups are a good exercise, but yeah, unfortunately, the answer is not push-ups exclusively. We generally have to work a lot harder than that. But some of these strands come up time and time again, and so they should be listened to. Right, folks, hopefully that was useful. A bit of a trip down memory lane. And